Welcome again. The Planetary Society Member Community Book Club is back with you live here in your member community. I'm Matt Kaplan, Senior Communications Advisor for the Planetary Society, former host of Planetary Radio, of course. Welcoming you once again for what I am absolutely sure is going to be another really fun and fascinating discussion with someone that I ran into, I don't know, at least a couple of times, Loren, as we were out there doing the space thing. Loren
Yes.
Grush is our guest and the author of The Six, The Untold Story of America's First Women Astronauts. If you have just joined us, we will be with you for at least an hour, maybe a little bit more if it goes as we have done in the past, but that kind of depends on your participation. We are going to be looking for your questions and comments about the book in the chat window right here in the member community in the live event. Amber Trujillo is out there, our a queen of the member community, and so much else that we do, particularly on the social media side here at the Planetary Society. Amber will, as always, be monitoring your questions and comments in the chat and relaying many of those to me. We'll get to as many of them as we can. And we'll talk a little bit at the very end about what's coming up for next month as well. So, here, direct from the fly cover of the book, Loren Grush is a reporter for Bloomberg News, specializing in all things space. Previously, she was a senior science reporter for the technology news website The Verge and hosted the online show Spacecraft, which took her across the country exploring what it takes to train for space. The daughter of two NASA engineers, which I did not know until I saw this and read her dedication, her notes at the back of the book. Grush grew up surrounded by astronauts and space shuttles. She has been published in the New York Times, Popular Science, and Nautilus magazine, and has appeared on several TV networks as an expert commentator. You can find her at LorenGrush.com. And of course, right now, you can find her here on your screen. Welcome, Loren.
Thank you so much. Yes, planetary.org, my current address.
Yes, thank you very much. The best one on the internet, across the entire internet, no doubt. You know, you've heard me tell you this already, as I've told everybody else out there. What a great story, or really 6 stories that you captured here. As you told us yesterday when Amber and I were talking with you, could easily have been 6 books, couldn't it?
Oh, yes, absolutely. In fact, there was much I had to cut out, mostly when it came to their lives prior to NASA, just because they have such storied, lives to begin with. And then obviously it only covers really their first flights with the program. So obviously many of them went on to fly even more and have careers outside of NASA. So yeah, this is just scratching the surface of what they've accomplished, really.
I learned a lot. I even learned a lot about people that I know pretty well. Like I first met Sally Ride and Tam O'Shaughnessy, her life partner and professional partner, something like 20 years ago. And that was when she was quite active supporting the Planetary Society. And we invited her to contribute a regular feature to Planetary Radio, which people can still hear if you go back to the earliest days of Planetary Radio on the website. And got to know them, came down to UCSD, to their Sally Ride Science headquarters, and just lovely, lovely people. But I had no idea until I read your book that Sally, and Tam went back much further than just the formation of Sally Ride Science and following Sally's ticket rides into space.
Yeah, that was one of the things I loved most learning about Sally, is that she really was a ride or die. Maybe not the best term, but you know what I mean? She really had, she would make these lifelong friendships from a very young age. And then it was really kind of, a full circle moment when she launched, because a lot of those people she stayed in touch with, even if she had been romantically involved with them, she still maintained a really active friendship with them. And they all got invites to her flight, when she became the first American woman in space. And so, yeah, I just thought that was a great trait about her. Very loyal friend, and even after a breakup.
I came away believing that NASA, for all of the mistakes it may have made at the time, did a pretty darn good job picking these 6 women.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I like about them, and I say this a lot in interviews, but I think it's very important, is just how different they all were and how diverse their backgrounds were in terms of the types of fields that they had, the experience that they had. I think it's a very important point just to show that really there's no path to space. There's no one route you can take. Clearly, there's you can be a doctor, you can be a physicist, you can be, and even now, I mean, we've evolved so far now beyond even needing those kinds of degrees. There's so many opportunities to get into space these days. But really, it did show that you didn't have to have this jet piloting experience, and I think that was helpful because there was a lot of skepticism at the time, that it wasn't just about women coming into the program. It was people who didn't have that military training. And I think they were such a great group, showing that you really could come from a variety of different backgrounds and be the optimal astronaut.
And we've had so many women follow in their footsteps, but as you point out in the book, they didn't have any role models. I mean, there was that group of women that had high hopes back in the days of the Mercury program. You barely address that because other books have covered that group of women that should have had a shot but got shot down really from the top by Lyndon Johnson, among others. But they really were pioneers, weren't they, these 6?
Yeah, and one thing they mentioned too, the irony is, going through their careers before NASA, that was kind of also the time when they probably had the most friction and most pushback, because they were also, it wasn't just when they came to NASA, it was, when they were trying to pursue chemistry or, medicine, that they would get a lot of discrimination. And that was also a time when they didn't have a lot of women peers along with them. They were already working in very male dominated industry. And then one thing Anna likes to say is, she mostly was, by herself during, when she was in surgery or in ER medicine as a woman. But then when she came to NASA, she had 5 new women colleagues, which was actually, kind of abnormal for her at the time. So weirdly enough, they had, they were able to kind of rely on each other a little bit when they got to the agency. But even before that, they were very used to working in all male environments.
What was the sort of balance that you do write about in the book some, but between the camaraderie among these 6 who had a lot in common, as diverse as they were, and yet they all wanted to get up there. And yes, most of them said, yeah, I don't care if I go first, second, or third, as long as I get to go. I mean, what was the balance there?
Yeah, I think they were all trusted colleagues. And I kind of touch on this in the book too. I think obviously, and I did this with the book, but the press was also trying to lump them into a group together, kind of portraying them as like this, tight-knit group. And while that was, true to an extent, it was more of a co-worker relationship, and some of them were closer to each other than others. For instance, Sally and Judy were particularly close. Ray and Anna were close because they had similar backgrounds, similar personal lives. But yeah, they could provide this united front when they needed. And there's some great hilarious examples in the book about that, when they pulled each other and said, hey, I need your advice on this NASA thing that is woman related. But yeah, they weren't necessarily best friends either. And yeah, I mean, there's also a chapter dedicated to this in terms of selecting the first woman. They all were very cognizant that one of them had to be the first to fly. And maybe they didn't talk about it openly, but, everybody was thinking about it. Everybody was, rumoring, thinking about the rumors of who would it be. And another thing is, it was an extremely competitive group of individuals. So it wasn't just the women, it was the men that they were flying with too, also wanted to fly as quickly as possible. And so when you have a group of, 35 people that have always succeeded and have had to fight to succeed, obviously everyone in that group is going to want to fly before the other person as soon as they possibly can.
You're making me think of other scenes in the book, like when the announcements were made of who was going to fly when, of that group of astronauts. And there were some really unhappy people. I mean, one astronaut you don't identify said, "This is BS," without the abbreviation. It's fascinating. And another thing that was really pleasing to me to discover in the book is that the women, by and large, discovered that being accepted by NASA, maybe not by all the individuals, but by the agency, was actually, they were pleasantly surprised at how well that went. And it was the media, as you were sort of alluding to there a moment ago, that really was, wrapped up in these old stereotypes.
Yeah, and I think I was a similar way about this too, because I had known of the so-called Mercury 13 going into this book, but I only knew their story, very briefly, and but I knew the adversity that they faced in trying to be taken seriously as astronauts, and so I thought, they were going to have a lot of pushback from NASA, and I was pleasantly surprised that they really did try to make space for them. Obviously, there's some very hilarious hiccups and clashes along the way, but they were very accommodating of them. And also speaking with the men that they worked with, maybe some of them were skeptical at the beginning, but it was very clear that they all loved them very dearly and became very close with them during their time working together. And yeah, the true antagonist of this book is the press, which was really funny for me as a space journalist myself. And then also just the culture. I felt like the press kind of channeled what the culture was thinking at the time, just in the way they asked questions, the types of questions they asked them, and the fact that some of the women would get questions that the men definitely did not get asked. And it's very clear double standard. And also the way they were written about and the headlines that would be used for them. That was a really enlightening experience for me, digging deep into what was considered the proper way to frame a story about women astronauts back in the 80s. It really, made me thankful to be living in our current time period. But, it's interesting. It wasn't even that long ago. It was 40 years ago. And the fact that, these types of questions were being asked and being framed that way, it was really, really surprising.
I keep glancing over at my notes, which I have lots of, but we are going to get to your questions, folks. And we already got one that's come in that I see that has been forwarded by Amber. A disappointment to me, because he's, in most of the books about the early astronauts, he really is painted as a real tough guy, but a hero. And that's Deke Slayton, one of the original Mercury 7, who basically, you talk about, got up in a room and said, "I want no part of this," and walked out.
Yeah.
I'd love to think he felt a little bit better about it when he started to see what a great job these women did.
I can't really speak to that, but I did think it was important to illustrate, not some of the heroes that we have didn't necessarily share such enlightened views at the time. Famously, like John Glenn, for instance, when he showed up at the hearing, there's, I assume the people listening are all space geeks, but just in case, there's a famous hearing where some of the members of that group were trying to lobby Congress to let them keep training and, try and emphasize why it was so important to let women fly. This was back in the 60s, fly to space. And the NASA component came in on one of the days of that hearing, and that included John Glenn. And, it was their testimony. He made a statement to the effect of, this is just the way our culture is. The men go off and fight the wars and fly planes, and the women stay home. And that's just how our society is structured. And, I think we all need to kind of remind ourselves that this was heavily entrenched in our society at the time, these kinds of structures and gender structures. And yeah, I think some of them probably didn't have, the best views, but the point is they changed over time. And, these women had to be the first. And unfortunately, they, had to deal with some of that initial, bad opinions, but ultimately they did it. And one thing they will say to me is that while they probably knew that there were some people who weren't necessarily on board, no one really said it to their face. So that probably helped them. And everybody that they did work with at NASA was encouraging. The press was a different story, but they were all very happy with their experience at NASA.
I also think of, the opposite of Deke Slayton, Bob Crippen, who was my guest, just a legendary astronaut, who, when he was given that opportunity to do a mission, he said, "I'll do it on one condition. You wrote about this. I did not know before this. I want to have Sally on the crew."
Yeah.
What a compliment.
Yeah, and I loved talking to those astronauts who were on the cruise with them, because they're really the ones that got such a close glimpse into their lives. And yeah, it's crazy to think that, it's people like Bob and then George Abbey, who we can also talk about too, how pivotal roles that they played in making history, right? Bob was very instrumental in voicing his support for Sally being the first on his flight. And so it's wild to be talking to those people. And, I'm asking them, did you know that you were making such a huge decision? And while I think they did, I think they were really just trying to make the best decision at the time. But now the history books are set because of those choices that they made. So it was really great to be able to talk to people like that. And, it was kind of like being in the room when history was being made.
Sally really didn't tolerate nonsense very well, or questions that she thought were out of line, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately for Sally, I feel like she got some of the worst questions being the first woman to go up. So yeah, I mean, there's that famous, and I FOIA'd NASA, Freedom of Information Act request, that press conference that she did prior to STS-7, which was her first flight. And honestly, it has to be watched, because it really shows just, the cringe level on her face when she was asked some of those questions. And you could tell from the very onset of the press conference just how she was like ready for battle, basically. She knew all these questions were coming for her. And all the questions did end up going to her, basically. And most famously, she was asked, if something went wrong in the simulator, if she wept. And, her response was just so perfect. She just laughed it off and was, why doesn't anyone ask Rick those questions? But she handled it all very well. But it definitely took a toll on her. I talk about that in the book too. While I know there was some skepticism over whether she understood exactly what she was getting herself into. Again, she was an astronaut, and the aim of an astronaut is to fly as early as possible. And so she was very excited to, just get to fly and be on a crew. But I don't think it really sunk in until after she came back, just exactly what she was taking on with that request and that assignment.
There's a quote from Sally that you have in the book. "It's too bad that our society isn't further along and that this is such a big deal," she said. "But I guess if the American public thinks that it's a big deal, then it's probably good that it's getting the coverage that it's getting." So she kind of understood where she was at with all of this. And I'd go even beyond, us talking about them opening the way for these other women astronauts. Wouldn't you agree that they probably had a big part in opening up all of these fields for women and perhaps other groups who, had either been locked out or had very limited and very painful access in the past?
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say that even though Sally maybe didn't think about it, right at the time when she was flying, she did come to, appreciate her symbolic nature for America and the impact she had, especially on little girls. And that ultimately, led her down her road of, outreach and education to children in STEM. But yes, I think when they came on, they were very cognizant of the fact that they were being watched. It wasn't that they could just, mess up and let it go by. They knew that every step of the way there was going to be extra scrutiny on them being the first women. And so, when you are the first in a group, and I'm sure that this was the same for the African American astronauts that joined with them, you're not just representing yourself, you're representing everybody like you. And so they knew that they had to go above and beyond because, and Sally even mentioned this before her flight too. I think a really prophetic statement she gave to Lynn Shure, who would end up writing her biography, is that her biggest fear is that she was somehow going to mess up. And for me, that speaks volumes, because it goes to show she knew that the headline would not be Sally Ride messed up on the flight. It would be first American woman in space messes up. And so, while they knew that it was perfection, or it would make waves for women down the road.
And, fortunately, she did pretty much perfectly, as did the women who followed her. Well documented in the book. If you've just joined us, we are talking with Loren Grush here in the member community about the six, which I hope all of you have enjoyed. Let me get to a question from Laura Monahan. Matt mentioned in his prep conversation, with Loren, that you both agreed that this could have been 6 separate books. But is there one specific story that you, Loren, really wished you could have fit into the book, but your editors talked you out of? You told us yesterday you had to leave out a lot, right?
Yeah, I would say it says specific story, but there was a ton about their childhoods that I really loved. For instance, there was a lot of stuff about Kathy, and I think I can't remember if I cut this out of the book, so forgive me, but she talks in her oral history about how she saw this toy gun, and she was fascinated with how it operated and the mechanisms within it. And so she brought this toy gun to school, or she had, talked about wanting this toy gun. And the teacher thought she was this little gun mole, but she was like, no, I'm fascinated with how the mechanisms work. And so that was kind of one of those early moments where she realized, she had that engineering type brain. So it was a lot of little things like that. But one thing that my editor told me, and he was absolutely right, is, when you do a biopic, or when you watch a movie, for instance, that's a biopic, you don't drop in when they were born. You come in, at the time the story begins. And so that's what I tried to do with those first few chapters about their, finding out about the program. I kind of tried to start, where were they when they found out about this opportunity, and then I sprinkled in how they got there. So that was it was meant to be more of help build the momentum from the beginning. But there is so much to discuss, and like I said, so much beyond the end chapter. I have a very short epilogue that kind of sums up their lives post Challenger, and it doesn't nearly do justice. So there's many sequels to be written, plenty of opportunities to continue the story.
I'm going to come back to some of that, and along with a number of the other things that we've talked about already. I think that story is in the book.
Maybe
either that, or I've heard it somewhere else. You're not the first author I've talked to who said, "Is that?" I think this is.
Yeah, forgive me, but I feel like there's so many versions of the book running through my head that I might be referencing one that exists and maybe one that does not.
Understood and totally forgiven. Albert Hagee, what was something you didn't know you would learn before you started writing the book? We've talked a little bit about some of the surprises. Anything else?
Yeah, one of the things that, some background. As a space reporter now, I feel like the astronaut selection process is still a bit of a mystery. We basically will hear these new classes of astronauts are selected. We hear these crews are selected, but we really don't have much insight into why. And so I was actually pleasantly surprised to learn how these people were selected. I had a lot of great in-depth interviews and details about, when they all came to Houston, the finalists, and when they came to Houston, how that process went. A lot of people were very open with me about that. And the astronauts also vividly remember those experiences because they were so surreal. And then also learning how the crews were selected for the shuttle missions, how Sally was selected. Obviously, there's still a bit of a mystery. And I think one thing I learned is that no matter how technical you try to make it, it's still a subjective process. Ultimately, came down to George Abbey's decision. And I don't know if that's a similar situation now. Again, it's kind of wrapped up in mystery. So it was nice to really peel back the curtain and get a peek into those really pivotal decisions and how they were made.
If there is a standout male character in this book, it's got to be George Abbey, I would think.
It's hard. I don't think anyone could write a better character. I mean, there was also, I don't want to phrase it as like there's a villain, but I'm always thinking of like who would be cast as in these characters, and definitely he would be a man of mystery. He'd definitely be a very enigmatic figure because he doesn't talk a lot, and he's doesn't say that. That was the other thing about George is he never told you where you stood, and so the astronauts, can you imagine having a boss like that who could get you into space but having no concept of where you are in the line? That would definitely make me go insane, I think.
Who was the astronaut with some co-conspirator did a Superman thing hanging outside George's window?
I think that was Jim Bagley, right? I have to look it up.
I think you're right. Yeah, I didn't even put that in my notes because he wasn't one of the 6. Here's a question from Violet Paola. Some argue that focusing solely on the firsts in history, like Sally Ride, overshadows the contributions of other amazing women astronauts, especially those facing additional barriers due to race. How do you address this in your book? And do you think we need to shift our narrative around women in space to be more inclusive? Well, you do kind of address it, and so did the women among the 6.
Yeah, I think one of the things I tried to note was that even though they were opening up these opportunities for women, it was still extremely difficult for women and people of color to meet those attributes. And one of the ways that NASA was able to open up the opportunities was they relaxed the criteria. So when I think of it that way, I think it just goes to show that all of these decisions and these barriers that are placed are a matter of choice. And NASA can say all along that, oh, we have to choose people this way because of A, B, and C, but ultimately they're the ones that build the spacecraft, right? They're the ones that set those requirements. So I tried to illustrate that, once you make those decisions, that's how you set those barriers into place. But even then, society was so behind that, when they relaxed the criteria, it still was very difficult for people of color to meet that criteria. So what I like to say in these interviews is that, moving forward, it might be a little harder to make design choices that are more inclusive. But at the end of the day, when you do think with inclusivity and diversity in mind, you ultimately make safer vehicles and you make it so that even everybody can be involved and be included. And so that's kind of the goal I'd like to take away. And also to be fair, I think there are so many more books and stories that should be told moving forward. Like I said, this is just the tip of the iceberg.
Right in line with that, Kevin Rush says, are you going to do another book to expand on this? He adds, great job. Wish you the best.
I would absolutely love to. Yeah, you should talk to my publisher. let's get it greenlit.
Sounds good.
No, but this is definitely something I'd like to, a topic I'd like to stay on top of for a while, at least, the people of space. I think when in my writing day to day, it's easy to just focus on the news and the hardware and the technologies that are being created, because obviously that's the flashy stuff and that's what gets the most attention. But at the end of the day, it's armies of people that are creating these things, and they all have really important stories to tell. Another thing that I think I've been thinking about too is the stories of the people behind the scenes, putting the shuttle up. Obviously not as flashy, but that's where my mom and dad worked. And, they were always telling me interesting stories and things. And, they don't go noticed at all. So I think there's so many more stories and topics to tap into. And I want to keep that momentum going.
I'm going to ask you a couple more from the members here, and then I might go back to a few more of mine, the host's prerogative here. Dustin Flaum, what is one of the funniest stories you came across in your research that didn't make it into the book? Or pick one from the book if you can't think of anything else.
Well, okay. In terms of hilarity, one of the things I like to highlight about the book is I think it's a comedy at the end of the day. Yes, there are tragic moments for sure, but truly, there are some hilarious moments of just the women navigating with NASA trying its best to be inclusive, but also making some hilarious missteps along the way. So obviously one of the funniest parts of the book is when Sally is doing her bench check. And I think it's a pretty famous story, but she was going through her items and we pulled Kathy Sullivan along to give her some much needed reinforcement. And, there was the pink plastic tube and she pulled on it and it was 100 tampons strung together.
I'm glad you brought it up because I would have turned red. I was going to bring it up if you didn't. So.
And just to be clear, she was going to space for 1 week. So they asked her if that would be enough. And she was like, you can cut it in half and we'll be fine.
Yeah. Good
but
example.
In terms of things that didn't make it into the book, the funny stories, just there were one of the things I learned about this group of individuals, the astronaut class, is they were, they acted a bit more like a frat house, sorority house sometimes. And that was surprising in a way, was learning just how crass they could be. They were cracking some really, non-PC jokes there, and they really liked to party. So I learned about some of their parties that they would throw, and I think I put in a story about like a hot tub. I don't remember if that made it into the book, but there was a bunch of astronauts trying to cram into a hot tub at one point. So just like funny things like that. It was great color, but maybe didn't make it past the finish line.
Do you remember which one of the six it was who had to strip down as a part of trying the new spacesuits, I think, and was with one of the male astronauts and said to the guy, hey, if you're worried about modesty, I don't have any.
Yeah, that was Kathy, because she was the first one to perform a spacewalk, or the first American woman to perform a spacewalk. And yeah, so when they were in the facility they were in getting ready, now there are locker rooms where there's gendered places to get dressed, but at the time they just didn't have that. It was just one big open hangar, and so they had that moment where they realized they had to strip down and get into their spacesuits, and they looked around and realized that we're going to do it here. And so Kathy broke the ice and said, I'm not modest if you are. And he goes, nope. And the best part is that everybody in the room ran for the exit because they were so embarrassed. The astronauts didn't care.
I'm glad we've gotten to Kathy, Catherine
Yes.
Sullivan. She is the other one of the six that I got to know somewhat well. Fascinating character, and so capable. I love the quote that I think she was talking to her father. It's in the book, where she told him, because she had applied to be an astronaut, and here she was following up on all this ambitious oceanographic work. And she said to him, it means that when I finish my degree, I'm either going 200 miles up or 6,000 feet down. And it turned out, basically she did both eventually, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing about Kathy is, she was just always an explorer from the beginning. I loved that she was obsessed with maps. And, for her, she's a great example of someone who had set their mind on something very concrete, but was very open to, finding different ways to achieve those goals. So it was very clear from the beginning that she wanted to explore. She wanted to find new things, discover new things. But then as she was navigating her academic life, she thought, oh, I have to learn a language. I have to learn languages to, be able to live abroad, study abroad. But then, she was told that she had to take these science classes, and then she realized, oh, this is really interesting. She took oceanography and geography, and she started to catch on to those fields and realized, oh, this is another avenue for exploring, going to sea and planning expeditions like that. So yes, I loved that she was very open to different paths that would take her where she needed to go.
Kathy is one of those ocean people who I think it was when I had this conversation with her, I can't remember if it was something for the radio or just casually, when she was no administrator, who, like a lot of other oceanographers and marine biologists that I've run into, said, boy, if only we could get X percent, some small percent of the NASA budget. Imagine what we could do with research on what covers most of our planet's surface. So I know how important that was to her. What I did not know and learned from your book is that she was asked not once, but twice to become NASA administrator.
I think you're referencing Sally, correct?
Sally asked? Yeah. My mistake. I had in my notes that it was Catherine. My apologies. You're right. I knew Sally was also asked, but I thought Catherine was too. Maybe not.
It's possible that Kathy also might have been asked. I think they all would make fantastic NASA administrators, but for Sally, she was definitely asked. And Sally was also, became well known for being part of, crash investigations. She was asked to be part of the Columbia investigation and the Challenger investigation. So, she was, even though she left NASA, she still left a really important mark, and she was very involved with the space agency throughout her life.
I'm going to come to talking about some of the other 6 and about that first of those 2 horrible disasters, the Challenger disaster. But here's a great question that came in from Clara McPeak. Was it hard to write a nonfiction book that reads like fiction, like a novel?
Yes.
The
answer is yes. Well, so going back to my editor, I had a great editor at Scribner, and he gave me some really great advice from the get-go before I even started writing, and that was to treat it like a screenplay. A lot of the times it's really easy, or not easy, but I think authors fall into the trap of, kind of information dumping. And especially with NASA and space, I think it's very easy to do that because there is so much detail that you can include and go in depth about. But he said, try and structure it like a series of scenes. And that was great advice. But then also, the color drained from my face because these are scenes that happened 40 years ago, and also no one recorded them, and we're kind of relying on memory, and people are, sometimes notoriously terrible narrators of their own lives. So, while I had that advice at hand, it was still a very tall task to achieve. But, basically I just had to, I kind of treated it like I was a detective. I was trying to find pieces of scenes throughout the archives when I was talking to people. If somebody mentioned that they said something, I would try and see if I could find them actually saying that thing or being quoted saying that thing. And when those 2 coincided, that was one of those magical moments because, they would reference something and then I would actually find them saying it. And sometimes they had remembered it exactly, or sometimes they hadn't remembered it well at all. And so I could kind of cross-check those things. But yes, that was kind of the backbone that I used for the book. And I feel like sometimes I was able to do that. The moments that really stood out to me are kind of what I call the flashbulb memories. So for instance, when the pad abort happened with Judy's flight, that was a moment where I felt like I could kind of just describe it moment by moment, because the people that were there and that talked to me vividly remember what it was like because they were so scared and freaked out about what was going on. So they remembered each moment, each sound, each joke that was made. And so those were just kind of like oh, I'm just writing what what is happening in real time. Same, unfortunately, the same can be said for the Challenger, where, everybody remembers where they were for Challenger. And so being able to piece that together, those were the scenes that were kind of just flowing out of me. So, and then there were the times where I didn't really have a lot of detail. And so I kind of had to, do some extra digging and try and find, how to piece those things together. And it could be difficult, but I tried my best to make it as scenic as possible.
You succeeded. This also speaks to the enormous amount of research that went into this book. And could you talk about contrasting that with what you more typically have done in your career, which is having a deadline and needing to put an article together for some magazine?
Yeah, that was
Bloomberg.
Probably the biggest shock experience of the whole thing is, as a reporter, our cycle lasts about a day or two tops. Maybe if you're working on a longer feature, you get a few weeks, a few months. But as a staff writer, we're constantly following the news constantly. And it's not unusual to get news of something, late night on a Tuesday and have to publish it Wednesday morning. We're constantly working on breakneck pace. So to have all of this time to sit and write as long or as short as I wanted, that was amazing. It felt great. But then there was also this kind of moment of dread because you don't have that forcing function of the deadline coming the next day to, kind of hanging over your head, making you write quickly. So what I tried to do was I gave myself, write 1,000 words a day. They don't have to be good, just get through it. And then also if I was on a streak, I tried not to go overboard. I would try to save that for the next day so that I at least had some momentum for the next day. So I was really just kind of chipping away. It's like, you're creating a statue and just chipping away at it ever so slightly every day. But it was definitely a brand new experience for me because I never worked at that kind of schedule before.
You had to have the discipline of an astronaut, one might say. Let's talk about some of these other women. And I'm thinking first of Anna Fisher, who had all the challenges that the other five had, performed beautifully, and did a good piece of it with a secret pregnancy.
Yeah, hers. When I was researching for the book, I was reading Lynn Sherr's biography of Sally Ride, and in it, she mentions just briefly how Anna was, watching the shuttle, watching the switches in the shuttle cockpit, before Sally's flight. And she was pregnant at the time, I think 8 months pregnant. And I just was like, that's how I want to open the book. I knew that because I just thought that was such a symbolic moment to have, the first, well, she wasn't the first pregnant astronaut, but having a pregnant astronaut in the cockpit of the shuttle, which would have never happened before, looking over the flight for the first American woman to fly. I thought it was just a really poetic moment. But yeah, and the thing about Anna is that, obviously they all got pretty awful sexist questions when they first came on board, but things had kind of subsided a little bit, because, Sally had flown, Judy had flown, Kathy had flown, as things become more normalized, more routine, the questions subsided. But then when she became the first mom to fly, that opened up like a whole new can of worms for people to question whether or not what she was doing was right as a mother. And, to me, that was probably the biggest sign of the double standard because, she was even asked in space how being a mom coincides with being an astronaut, or how being an astronaut, is good for her motherly duties or something like that. Here she is surrounded by her male colleagues. Many of them had children, and, none of them get asked that question. So for her, she had that extra layer of scrutiny. And she even knew at the time that people were criticizing her for making that decision. But she, held strong. And it's so good that she did, because there are so many moms that have come after her. And, it's funny. I started off this book tour process, saying, at least, they've made it easier, right? The women have made it easier for the women that came after them. But I've still been seeing some of those comments with some of the newer astronauts who are flying, criticizing them for being moms and going to space. And it's even crazier to me when they go on these commercial flights that are like 5 minutes, they're not even in space for very long. And yet they still get criticized for, leaving their children behind. So I'd like to say we have, moved past that way of thinking, but sometimes I'm still reminded that maybe that's still around.
I think we've made progress, but we're not there yet.
Yeah.
Shannon Lucid, I just couldn't believe that here, as she's waiting for launch, she takes a nap. I just don't think that there are very many of the male astronauts or any of the female astronauts who could have pulled that off. Talk about calm, cool, and collected.
Yeah, I love Shannon. I just think she has the best personality. I don't know. I think I've seen some astronauts taking a snooze on some live streams, but I think that just means that they're so prepared, right? They feel so confident and trusting that, this is a moment to get some shut eye. Also, probably they're in those cockpits for so long. I probably would fall asleep too. But no, I think Shannon was just so matter of fact about everything, and just really took, I think when there's a great quote about her in the book from one of her colleagues about, everyone knew that if you gave Shannon a task, she would do it. And you didn't have to say anything to her. She just knew how to handle herself. She knew how things could get done. And I think that's just a great way of describing her. She was just a very, go with the flow kind of person. And that came through when I spoke to her. And she had such great stories to tell. But yeah, it does not surprise me one bit that she fell asleep.
One of my favorite themes in the book, and there are several episodes of this, are where astronauts had to, pull in Apollo 13. Something didn't go the way it was expected to go, and they had to come up with a solution, which now the solutions didn't always work, but they sure were brilliant in their attempts to make things happen, which even after their months and months and months of practice, nobody had considered, and they had to improvise tools and things like that. Is there one of those that stands out?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of my favorite flights to write about was Anna's mission because of just how quickly it came together and how it really was, I love the idea of designing for things that weren't meant to be retrieved, or having to go and interact with a vehicle that wasn't meant to be interacted with. I think those kinds of engineering challenges are so incredible. So I really liked that moment. But obviously, yeah, Ray's mission is a great example too, because that was one where they completely, reoriented their mission, and they did an unplanned spacewalk. Ray had to create these makeshift tools out of things that were already on the shuttle. And they did it. They went through the whole process and performed flawlessly. Obviously didn't save the satellite, unfortunately, but the fact that they were able to do it in such a short time frame, knowing NASA now and how they operate, I don't really feel like we see a lot of those quick turnarounds anymore. Everything is very planned, very methodically thought out. So for them to completely redo the mission midst mission, that was kind of a wild thing to see as somebody who's been covering human spaceflight for a while.
Was it Ray, about whom, after she pulled off this great thing, she had to piece together, create a tool, that somebody said that she was a good seamstress, and Sally Ride tapped the person on the shoulder and said,
"Good surgeon."
Yeah, right.
And those were just one of those moments where, yeah, they would really, it was illustrative that they would stick up for each other when they needed to be stuck up for each other. Maybe they weren't hanging out all the time at the bar after work, but they definitely noticed when someone needed, that kind of camaraderie.
of the four of these women that I have never spoken to, I guess the one that I have for many years wished most that I could have, no offense to the others, is the one that none of us can speak to again, and that's Judy, of course, Judy Resnick, who we so tragically lost in the Challenger disaster. But I did not realize that on her first time in space, there was this event that should have tipped off people at NASA that there might just be some attention we need to pay to these O-rings and be a little bit more careful. It was awful to read about that as this sort of, sense of foreboding that it gave me, knowing what was going to happen.
Yeah, but at the time, I'm sure it wasn't that foreboding to NASA because, and there are so many great books about Challenger that do much more justice than I could do in my book alone. But they talk about I think the term is, the acceptance of deviance, right? The idea that over time, this thing didn't break the shuttle, did not, ruin the flight plan. So, okay, we can accept that level of not performing as expected. And that just kind of built up over time. But yes, at the time, it probably wasn't that foreboding. But, when you have the luxury of hindsight, you look back and you say, oh, what an eerie thing to have happened on this one particular flight. So yeah, it was when I learned that, I thought, wow, that is, it's morbid, but it was definitely, I think, a good foreshadowing. And there were a lot of moments foreshadowing. One of the things I tried to show building up to Challengers is kind of how NASA was becoming more and more acceptable with risk. And it wasn't just with, the performance of the O-rings, but it was also, the types of people that were flying. They were accepting, non-astronauts into the program, flying
senators, teachers.
Yeah, exactly. And, we can talk about whether or not that was a good idea, but it was just going to show that, this was something that NASA was becoming more and more comfortable with. And, same in terms of the types of things that were flying. I mentioned a satellite that one of the crew was, reluctant to fly because it hadn't passed any acceptance testing or safety testing. But at the time, NASA was, in his mind, was a little more, they were a
little more cowboy. We got to keep up the cadence. We got to keep launching these things.
And there was all that pressure. Exactly. So, it was just kind of a perfect storm that was brewing over time. And it was little moments like that I wanted to highlight to show, this is what we're heading toward.
I sure remember where I was for both disasters, but Challenger, I was actually, when I was still working at the university, I was in our satellite receiver room watching it happen and had to go home after that. I have talked with some astronauts and others who were part of the aftermath, the recovery. And you do talk about that. It's a hard part of the book to read, but to read about how these women were very much a part of that recovery. I mean, you talk about how Kathy Sullivan went and spent time with some of the wives of the male astronauts who'd been lost. And in fact, had a little bit of a role. Or wait a minute, I may have it confused with Sally now.
No, it's Kathy.
Okay.
The Challenger Center. Yeah, she basically would listen and
generate the Challenger Center. Yeah.
Yeah, it was encouraging to make something positive out of this tragic event. So she just kind of lent a listening ear, but was very encouraging of doing that. And then the other women too, I have to commend them. Like a lot of them had to do a lot of tedious work for years after that. Going through the checklists, streamlining everything. It wasn't glamorous stuff, but they did it. And that stuff was really crucial to getting the program back on track. So they all made sure they did their part in some way. And then obviously Sally had a very big role to play in, determining what happened with Challenger, but each one of them, all made sure that they tried to do some kind of, part that they could, help with. And it wasn't always, you know, it was definitely a moment where they had to step back and be like, okay, what's good for the program, not necessarily what's good for my career.
I wanted to go to Sally next as part of this process because, as you mentioned, she was on the Challenger Commission that was coming up with what went wrong and how do we avoid it happening again. What I did not know is that she had so much to do with the graphic demonstration that was done by somebody else, Richard Feynman, that so well demonstrated why those O-rings were at fault.
Yeah, I think, again, the story, sometimes I say it was difficult and it was difficult to write, but there are some moments where you just think how history is even more fantastic than fiction, because the fact that Sally was so instrumental in being this whistleblower. I mean, essentially she was a whistleblower, right? You know, no one ratted her out until the very end, but you know, she basically was the one to give information, kind of feed it along the chain that showed that the O-rings, you know, became more brittle when it got cold. And I just thought, I mean, again, another one of those moments, and I guess this is Sally playing, you know, she's the one that kind of swoops in and supports the women when they need it. But I just thought that was such an amazing thing. And also knowing that Sally and Judy were so particularly close, you know, that stayed in the back of my mind when I was writing it, because it was, you know, obviously she was doing this for her friends who are all on board, but for Judy in particular, you know, that really struck me. And it just was such a heartwarming moment to know that she was so instrumental in helping to solve this mystery.
It struck me that way as well. We are nearing the top of the hour. It sounded like you're okay with sticking around for a couple extra minutes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. I've got one from Dustin Flaum again, who we've already heard from. What advice from all of your research do you have for the first woman who will walk on the moon? Interesting question, Dustin. Someone who will experience many of the same challenges as the six. Let's hope it's a little bit easier for that first woman.
I really hope so. I think, unfortunately, my biggest advice for her is to know how to handle the question, how does it feel?
Which they came to hate, right? The six, yeah.
Yeah. I think that's probably going to be the hardest one or she's going to get that a lot, basically. And just being prepared for it and knowing how to answer it. You know, hopefully we'll have a better press corps. I mean, we have a great press corps right now. I shouldn't say we have a better press corps. We'll have a better press corps than the one they had back in the 80s, even though a lot of them were fantastic. But hopefully we can have some questions that move beyond that. But I do think that one is unavoidable.
There are so many more people in the press corps now, the space press corps, who look like you rather than me. And that is a very good thing. You mentioned your epilogue and following people afterward a little bit. I don't think we'll go into all of them, but I invite you to mention anything that you like about any of the six. But I'm going to come back to Sally again, because, you know, she's the one I was the closest to and missed the most. And what she did with her life after that. I mean, first of all, it was this revelation, which also, I think, struck a blow for what's the word I want to use, for not freedom, but for the right of everyone to be who they are, that came after her time as astronaut. I mean, I think you say it was only 9 years of her life, right, that she was an astronaut.
Yeah, but I mean, obviously that's what she's remembered for, but those 9 years had a huge impact on how she lived the rest of her life too, because as I mentioned earlier, you know, she started to come around to the idea that she was this big symbol for young women and that she had made this big impact during her time. And so that ultimately led her to seeing children and getting asked questions by children, and her learning that her passion was to inspire children, mostly young women, to go into STEM education. And so that, you know, led her to create Sally Ride Science, which she did with Tam O'Shaughnessy, her life partner. So, you know, while NASA was a small part of her life, it ultimately led her down the path that she would, live on until she passed.
And it is still very much a viable organization, Sally Ride Science. You can find it online and see what they're up to. Like the Planetary Society, a very worthwhile nonprofit, one that is worthy of your support. I am very proud that when I am in the right spot in my basic home community of San Diego, that I now and then get a glance at a beautiful oceanographic research vessel called the USS Sally Ride. It just, every time I see it, it's very emotional for me. It just seems to be such a wonderful legacy, because she was, of course, a professor of physics at UC San Diego, even as she was running Sally Ride Science with Tam.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anybody else that you want to mention about, I mean, because you were in touch.
I was going to bring up, speaking of the ocean, one thing that I thought was so crazy was, as I was starting to write the book, Kathy was still making history. She was, I think it was in 2020 that she dove to Challenger's Deep, becoming, I think, the only person to have walked in space and to have dove to the deepest part of the ocean. So
you do say that in the book, yeah.
Yeah, right. And the wild part about writing the epilogue too was that there was a moment where I had to just decide that I was done, because A, they were still making history, and B, the numbers of people who were going into space were constantly changing and growing. So at one point, I think I had a certain number of women who had been to space, but as we went through edits and were waiting to publish the book, more women had gone into space, which is always so encouraging. So, I'm sure that some of the things that I've written in the epilogue are now out of date because things are happening so fast in the space industry these days. Another thing, I think before, when I had submitted one version that didn't have the Artemis 2 crew involved, and then they were announced at one point, and I tried to get them in as quickly as possible because, we were going to have another woman making history, Christina Cook. And so it was kind of an interesting experience getting the epilogue out the door, because things are happening so fast and history is constantly being made that, the new changes were coming every so often that I was like, wait, let me put this in.
And we'll continue. Let's hope. We're in the home stretch here. You said at the end of the book, it had taken decades, but the agency had finally learned an important lesson. Courage and perseverance in the most pressure-filled situations aren't traits that are exclusive to a single gender or race. I mean, if there is something you want to leave all of us with out of this book, would that be a big part of it?
Yes, absolutely that. But also, and maybe this is kind of wrapped up in that sentiment too, these women, they were just women trying to do a job, and their job happened to be an extraordinary one that took them, miles above the earth. But ultimately, they were just trying to do their passion, do their job. And, they had to do it in a much more heightened scrutiny environment than we all have to do. But they did it. And because of their passion and because they loved it so much, they opened this door for so many people to come after them. And so I really just tried, what I wanted people to take away from the book is like, oh, I just made some new friends. These are people that I could have known myself, and they were ordinary and extraordinary all at the same time.
I'm going to close with one more question, and I'm afraid it came in before we started this live stream, and I can't remember who in the community asked, but here it is. What book would Loren recommend most highly of those that you came to love and rely on as you were writing this book? You said, I highly recommend these books, because you have a nice list at the end of the 6. I highly recommend these books to those who want to go deeper into the struggles and triumphs of the 6. Were you just looking around for it?
Yeah, because I have one signed by Ray up here. Her autobiography is fantastic. She goes into an amazing detail into her life and how she came on board with the program. Her romance with Hoot Gibson, who also is a great source for the book. Yeah, if you want to learn about Sally Ride, I see it published in the chat. Lynn Sherr's biography is the definitive text in terms of Sally's life. Kathy Sullivan also has a fantastic autobiography where she goes into detail about her experience with the Hubble Space Telescope and how she helped to create the tools and help design the space shuttle. I mean, it's very informative, but also she intersperses that with her childhood and her experiences at NASA. And then even Shannon has her an autobiography as well. It's mostly about her time on the Russian Mir space station. It's called Tumbleweed, and that is also a great read. I think it's a pretty short read, but it's great if you want to learn more about what really made her famous, which was her record-breaking stay on Mir, which again didn't have much time to get into, didn't have any time to get into. Let's be honest. So I think that is also worthy of chronicling and learning about as well.
Members, if you have not had the chat window open, Amber has been doing her usual fantastic job of providing links to many of the things that Loren and I have been talking about over the last more than an hour. I heartily recommend that you take a look there. She's got Rhea Seddon's homepage up at the moment, along with Tumbleweed, 6 Months Living on Mir by Shannon Lucid. The book we have been talking about, of course, is here, The Six by Loren Grush, which I know a lot of you have enjoyed. If you haven't gotten to it yet, I got to open it up fast here. It is published by Scribner. It is still very much available. And Loren, it has, exactly as I expected, been utterly delightful to talk with you over the last more than an hour. Thank you for this wonderful book. Thank you for these heroic tales of these six pioneers. And for spending this time with us today.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure being here.
And for the rest of you, whoops, as he bumps his microphone, very unprofessional, we will continue because, as you may have seen here in the book channel, the book club channel or space in the member community, we have already announced that our February book is this one, Moonrush, and it's being made out of focus by my camera, by the guy that I call the dean of space reporters, space journalists, Leonard David, another good friend, and he will also be delightful to talk to. We haven't picked the date yet. At the end of February, when we'll have our conversation with Leonard, but it's another great read, and we have other really fun stuff in store for you ahead. I will continue to see you here in the member community, especially in the book club space. Thank you to all of you who joined us. And if you missed any portion of this, as always, we will, as soon as it's processed and we can get it up, it will be available on our website, and it will be on the Planetary Society's very popular YouTube channel as well. So again, thank you, all of you, for joining us. And yeah, Loren, one more time, thanks for doing this and for all of your great work.
Thank you so much.
You bet. Take care, everybody. Have a great evening or whatever time it is where you are, and we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.